Hello, my friends, and welcome to Evergreen Perspective. I'm Ben Chrisley, and I truly appreciate you spending time with me. I know you got a ton of things to do, and you could be doing a lot of other things right now. So whether you're sitting back, enjoying a nice hot cup of coffee or a cold beverage, I just want to let you know I appreciate you being here. It really means a lot. Today, we're going to dive into something that may not seem like it affects your everyday life, but trust me, it does. We're going to talk about tariffs. Now, I get it. Tariffs sound like one of those economic buzzwords that politicians and news anchors throw around, but here's the thing. Tariffs aren't just about government policy. They impact the price of everything we buy every single day. They also affect the jobs available in our communities and how other countries perceive who we are as a trade partner. So whether you're someone who closely follows trade policy or you're just wondering why the price of your groceries, your lumber, and other goods keep creeping up on you, this conversation is for you. All right, we're going to break down the history of tariffs. We're going to look at how they shaped economies in the past. Most importantly, we're going to figure out how they're affecting us today. So just hang in there. It's a lot of information. We're going to get it in there, okay? So before we get into all that stuff, I'd like to introduce you to our friend Tom that we're going to hear about throughout the podcast today. Tom the Lumberjack, all right? So imagine standing in the middle of the dense Gifford Pinchot National Forest. The air is crisp and the scent of pine is filling your lungs. The rhythmic sound of a chainsaw is biting into wood, echoes through the trees. This is where Tom feels at home, right? This is where Tom has worked for 20 years in industry, just like his father and his grandfather before him, all right? The timber isn't just a job for these guys. It's a way of life. They pass it down through generations. He grew up in the small Washington town where the economy was built on logging. As a kid, he'd watch his father come home proud of him for the work that he got done every day. And his father was exhausted, but his father was also proud, knowing that he was putting food on the table and clothes on his children's back and helping to support a thriving economy. Now, Tom, obviously, he's got a family of his own now. He's got 2 children, his wife. He always assumed that growing up, they'd have the same opportunities that he had in the timber industry, that it would always be there for him. Good, steady work, supporting the community. But lately, things have been getting a lot harder. The industry that has supported his family for generations is facing new challenges. His paycheck, it doesn't stretch as far as it used to. The cost of fuel, equipment, and other materials, they keep rising. In the meantime, mills are closing or having to cut back. Friends and neighbors are losing their jobs. So now let's dive into the history of tariffs and see if we can figure out how they might be affecting Tom and his community. Where did they come from? Why have governments used them for centuries? And most importantly, what have they done to economies, businesses, and everyday people? First, tariffs have been around for a long time. The early days, governments have used them to generate revenue, obviously, protect domestic industries, and influence trade policy. One of the earliest examples of the U.S. using tariff is the Tariff Act of 1789, which helped fund Young America. Back then, tariffs were one of the primary in-sources that we had for federal income. So why were they more effective back then than they are today, right? Their success doesn't quite translate as well to modern times as it once did. So let's take a look at why. So before the 16th Amendment, which introduced federal income tax in 1913, the U.S. government had very few ways to collect money. Tariffs were the primary source of federal funding everything from infrastructure to national defense. Unlike today, tariffs only make up a very small fraction of the government revenue. Back then, though, early tariffs were essential to keep the country running and growing, right? The U.S. was still emerging economy in the 18th and 19th century with far fewer established industry. Tariffs helped American manufacturers compete against stronger European businesses by making foreign goods cost more money. So it made the foreign goods being imported more expensive, right? But today, unlike early tariffs, they disrupt supply chains, right? Because trade was simpler back then, it was less interconnected, right? By the 19th century, most goods were produced locally, imported in much smaller quantities since consumers weren't as heavily dependent on foreign-made products, right? We're dependent on so much stuff that's made outside the United States now, stuff that we don't even have the current capabilities to manufacture here. Tariffs had little impact on everyday prices back then. But today, right, electronics and automobiles and raw materials to make all those items are imported. So tariffs have a much larger, broader effect for the cost of both businesses and consumers, right? Tariffs were widely seen as necessary tool back then, right? Both major political parties supported them as a way to protect American industry from stronger European competitors. But today, however, tariffs spark an intense debate over free trade versus protectionism, right? With many businesses and consumers opposing them due to the risk of higher prices and trade wars. Back then, tariffs worked because the U.S. economy was still growing, competition was limited, and people weren't as dependent on foreign goods. Today, we live in a globalized world where tariffs it's just completely different, right? They also drive up prices now. They disrupt supply chains. They create economic uncertainty. So what once helped America now seems to be putting it's a higher risk game now, right? So let's continue our journey through history, though. Let's keep it going here. We had the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Anyone? Bueller. As the country grew, so did the reliance on tariffs. So by the 19th century, tariffs weren't just a way to fund the government, they became a tool to protect American industries from foreign competition, right? This especially came true in the Industrial Revolution, when the U.S. has rapidly expanding its manufacturing capabilities. Our leaders wanted to keep the goods from European manufacturers out because they were more established. So we wanted a chance for our industry to grow up, right? So throughout the 1800s and 1900s, tariffs remained there, right? So some saw them as necessary for economic growth while shielding American industry from foreign dominance, right? Others, particularly those in agricultural and trade-heavy regions, started to see them as a burden, though, because they were driving up the cost and they were provoking retaliation from other countries for their goods that they were trying to send. Because our farming industry, agriculture industry, was a lot more established in the United States before the Industrial Revolution. If we fast forward all the way to 1929, the U.S. was facing some major crisis, right? The stock market had just crashed, ushering in the Great Depression. So two lawmakers, Senator Smoot and Representative Hawley, right? That's how we got the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, right? Anyone? What was the goal of the Hawley Tariff Act, right? It was goal was to raise money for America. They thought that raising tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods would encourage Americans to buy domestic products. The thinking was that the foreign goods would become too expensive and Americans would turn towards the alternatives, and that would keep the factories open and workers employed. But things did not go as planned. The act passed in 1930, but instead of helping the economy recover, it made things extremely worse. Other countries retaliated, right? They started adding their own tariffs in, cutting off American exports. Suddenly, U.S. farmers who relied on selling their crops overseas found themselves unable to compete in foreign markets. Prices for American agricultural products collapsed. Businesses that relied on exports suffered, and unemployment was through the roof. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, is now widely considered as a cautionary tale, a tariff that was meant to protect American industries, but instead deepened the Great Depression. It's a reminder that when tariffs can seem like a simple fix, they often come with unintended consequences. So what does this mean for today? Well, history has a way of repeating itself. Just like in Tom's case, tariffs were meant to support American industry, but the real-world impact has been far more complicated. They've raised costs for businesses, hurt exports, and left workers wondering about future tariffs. So tariffs have played a major role in shaping the U.S. economy. We know that. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not. As we'll see, the debate is far from over. If we fast forward to today, and the debate has changed. The modern Republican Party, under the banner of America First, aggressively pushes tariffs to shield American industries, yet at the same time, it loudly champions free markets. But here's the contradiction. Tariffs do the exact opposite of promoting free trade. By making imports more expensive, they limit competition and they limit the open market system that conservatives claim to support. So which is it? Free trade where businesses compete openly or government-imposed tariffs that pick winners and losers. The hypocrisy is at the heart of today's tariff debate, right? So many businesses and consumers are pushing back, pointing out that while tariffs can help certain industries in the short term, they drive up costs and hurt international relationships and contradict the very principles that free market economics stand for, right? That Republicans claim to stand for. So modern global supply chains are highly interconnected. Today, a single product may be designed in the U.S., manufactured in multiple different countries, and then assembled someplace else altogether. The complexity makes tariffs more disruptive now than in the past when economies were more localized, trade relationships were much simpler, right? Retaliation was much less common back then because in the past, fewer nations had the economic leverage to retaliate against U.S. tariffs. Today, trade wars escalate quickly as countries impose counter tariffs, making it harder for tariffs to function one-sided economic advantage. In the 19th century, America had a more self-sufficient economy, while today, retaliatory tariffs from countries like China and the European Union can significantly impact U.S. exports. This is how trade wars begin. There's only one clear loser, and that is the hard-working American, just like you and me. So basically, tariffs were more effective in the past because the U.S. economy was less dependent on global trade. Federal revenue relied heavily on tariff income, and domestic industries were still growing, benefiting from protectionist policies. In today's interconnected world, tariffs are often unintended consequences, making them a far more controversial, complex economic tool than they once were. So why haven't tariffs worked as well in modern times? We've already hit on several key points, but let's hit on some more to make sure that we have a full understanding. It really comes down to how much the world has changed, right? We know the world is a much larger place. It's a much more interconnected place. We know that back in the early days, the U.S. economy was more self-contained. It helped American industries grow, and it didn't cause too much disruption because we had everything we needed made here in the USA. Today, though, as I've said, everything's more interconnected, right? A car designed in the U.S., but it still maybe comes from Canada, and its electronics may be from China, right? With some tires from Europe. Slapping on a tariff on one part of that supply chain increases the cost all the way up and down. And guess what? Final product becomes more expensive to who? You and me. We get to pay more. Because why, right? We get to pay more. Another big reason tariffs struggle today is because of the retaliation factor. In the past, countries didn't have that power, right? When U.S. imposed tariffs back then, other nations, they didn't have as much leeway. They didn't have the same juice they have, right? But now they respond by taxing our exports, right? This means American farmers and manufacturers and businesses that sell all around the world suddenly find themselves at a great disadvantage. We saw a good example of this during Trump's first administration, when his Republican-led tariffs on China promoted retaliation. China specifically targeted American agriculture, making it much harder for U.S. farmers to sell their products abroad. The Trump administration's tariff war with China was a prime example of how protectionist policies can backfire, especially on industries that depend on global trade. So when the U.S. slapped this tariffs on the Chinese good, China retaliated by hitting American agriculture hard. They targeted it very specifically. They imposed steep tariffs on U.S. exports like soybeans and corn and pork and other farm products, things that American farmers rely on selling to Chinese buyers. Since China was the largest buyer of soybeans at the time, it was a devastating blow to farmers, especially in the Midwest. With exports suddenly plummeting, many American farmers found themselves stuck with surplus crops they couldn't sell. Prices tanked, and farms, some of them had been in the family owned for generations, were on the verge of going under. To soften the blow, the Trump administration rolled a massive bailout payment through the USDA, totaling about $28 billion in aid to the farmers. This was, ironically, a form of government intervention, something that free market conservatives typically oppose. So in trying to protect American industries with tariffs, the administration ended up forcing the government to prop up the very farmers who were hurt by these policies. Instead of allowing free market where farmers could sell their goods freely, the government had to step in with billion-dollar subsidies essentially using taxpayers' money to fix a problem that it had created. The hypocrisy of American first economic policies. On one hand, they claim to champion free markets, but on the other, it actively distorted the market with tariffs and bailouts. Meanwhile, who suffered? Farmers suffered, right? The American people suffered, losing long term trade relationships with China, right? China ended up turning to Brazil. So many of those deals never came back to American farmers, leaving the U.S. farmers way worse than they were. So while tariffs have been sold as a way to protect American industry, they actually hurt major sectors of the economy and lead to costly government funded band aid solutions that run completely counter to the free market ideals Republicans claim to uphold. So I guess the question is, do tariffs help anyone? Sure, in some cases, but it really depends on how they're applied. Some industries do get a boost, especially when struggling to compete with heavily subsidized foreign competition or facing unfair trade practices. But the key question is, are tariffs actually helping the overall economy, or are they just shifting the problem elsewhere? So let's take steel and aluminum as an example. The Trump administration slapped tariffs on imported metals. U.S. producers initially saw a short-term boost, but by making foreign steel more expensive, right? Domestic mills got an edge. So people were like, well, I'm going to buy domestic because now it's costing the same price as the foreign steel. But, herein lies the problem is that many in the industry rely on steel and aluminum from car manufacturers to construction companies, right? So the price of everything from trucks to new homes go up, right? For the steel prices going up just because domestically the steel price became the same price as the imported price, it's still more expensive. So if the cost of auto production goes up, what happens to the price of cars? They go up too. And guess who pays that? You and I do. Hardworking American people are the ones that end up paying for these tariffs. So in the end, they didn't really help anybody there. So I don't know. Some industries could benefit from a more targeted tariff approach, perhaps, rather than some blanket, blunt instrument type tariff. So let's take a look at how maybe a more targeted approach might work, or how maybe we've used it in the past. Tariffs, as we know, let's back up so that the United States has long been dependent on foreign sources for semiconductors. Let's talk about semiconductors and rare earth minerals, right? That's a big hot topic, both of which are essential for modern technology, military defense, and just general overall economic stability, right? And the response, we rely on our reliance is more on China and Taiwan, right, for these semiconductors, right? And speaking of Taiwan, why does the U.S. care so much about Taiwan, right? I think a lot of us wonder why we hear Taiwan a lot. We want to know why the U.S. maintains such a strong military presence in the Taiwan Straits. Why do we Navy ships regularly patrol in that area? And why does Taiwan's independence seem to be such a high priority for American foreign policy? Well, the answer is pretty complex, right? It's just a small island out in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. has justified the presence in the region under a broad principle of maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific area, a way of saying that no single country, including China, should be able to dictate trade routes, airspace, or economic policy by region, right? We want international seas and free trade to continue, right? By keeping that naval and air presence there, the U.S. signals that it's committed to upholding international law and deterring aggressive moves by Beijing. Just in February, this past February, 2 U.S. ships conducted some operations through the strait, and that made a little bit of waves, no pun intended. But it's meant to show that, hey, we can reinforce our commitment here, and we got force in the region, and we're standing behind Taiwan. But our relationship with Taiwan goes beyond just geopolitics. And here's a few reasons why Taiwan is so important to us. Taiwan, obviously, its location makes them, a center point of balance in the Pacific. The island sits along that first island chain, and it prevents authoritarian regimes, particularly China, from expanding their military influence deeper into the Pacific. So if Taiwan were to fall under Beijing's control, it could shift the whole power in that region. So we like to maintain our presence there because we obviously don't want that to happen. But the other reason is Taiwan plays an outsized role in the global economy, particularly when it comes to these semiconductors we're chatting about. Taiwan is home to TSMC, the world's most advanced chip manufacturer. And we need those chips for all kinds of things, right? From smartphones to fighter jets. Without Taiwan, our tech sector and military would face some pretty massive disruptions. So that's a pretty important little island there. The other reason we like to support Taiwan, or at least one of the reasons why we always have, is because they have one of the strongest democracies in Asia, right? Which is a tradition that aligns well with the United States, the kind of relationships we want to have around the world, promoting democracy, right? But under the Republican Trump administration, that commitment has started to look a little bit different, kind of taking a little bit more of that transactional approach. In the past, administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, have supported Taiwan based on strategic interest and shared democratic values. But the Trump administration's foreign policy is different. Instead of treating Taiwan as a critical domestic ally, Trump has framed U.S. military support as transactional. At one point, he even suggested that Taiwan should pay the U.S. for their defense, as if it's not a mutually beneficial relationship. Give me a break. This raises the question, is this administration backing Taiwan because it believes in protecting democracy, or is Taiwan just another bargaining chip in a larger strategy against China? Right? Then there's the human rights contradiction. Right? In previous decades, U.S. foreign policy has often positioned America as a global leader in defending democracy and human rights. But the Trump administration has focused more on nationalist and transactional politics, reducing emphasis on these traditional values. At the same time, Trump's domestic policies here at home have raised major human rights concerns, from restricting healthcare access for transgender, from women's health to limiting asylum protections for survivors of trafficking and domestic violence. These actions directly contradict the idea that America's commitment to Taiwan is rooted in a broader mission to support democracy and human rights. So that leads to a bigger question. Can a government that's rolling back human rights protections at home continue to claim they're championing human rights and democracy abroad? I don't know. That sounds like that could be a podcast all on its own for another day. So I'm going to move forward on this issue here a little bit. Because always in the past, Taiwan's always had a strong bipartisan support from Congress. We got the laws like the Taipei Act of 19, which Trump actually signed during his first term, showed that the Congress remains to strengthening Taiwan's international presence. So hopefully keep that in place. At the end of the day, Taiwan remains super critical to what we do here in the U.S. So even if the nature of that relationship changes to more transactional, let's hope that that relationship doesn't fall through, because that could have negative implications with our power struggle with China, right? So anyway, because we talked about Taiwan, now we're getting into semiconductors and rare earth minerals. Let's kind of talk about how that might move forward and how we can chat about that for a little bit. We know China is the number one producer of rare earth minerals in the world. And they have the manufacturing capability to produce them. And so you needed to do something about that. And so this is where getting specific role of tariffs might have on that industry is what more target approach might look like, right? So there's strategies on tariffs, right? One that the Trump administration seems to like to take was just this broad stroking, blunt hammer that just puts tariffs on everything across the board, which is, as we've heard earlier, is very disruptive to the American economy and ends up putting us, in the crosshairs of having to pay more for all our goods. I mean, how much more as a hardworking American can we continue to sacrifice for poor policy and decision making, right? So I don't know. It's very disruptive. I would say this: we did take a more targeted approach during the Biden administration. They were pairing tariffs with direct industry investment. So in 2024, Biden introduced tariffs focused on critical sectors specifically. So that gets into the semiconductors, right? A 50% tariff on imported chips, right? Went into effect in September of 24. They put a 25% tariff on Chinese rare earth magnets, right, which were essential for electronics and stuff like that. That's due to take effect in 2026. But those tariffs aren't alone. They're not enough, right? So to make domestic production viable, we have to invest in that as well, and that became the Chips and Science Act, right? So it allocated $52 billion to rebuild U.S. semiconductor production here in the U.S., right? So we put tariffs on a product, and then we supported that product domestically at home with other pieces to help it be successful, right? Intel received almost $8 billion to subsidize manufacturing plants in Arizona and Ohio. The total plan invested $90 billion. They invested another $440 million from the Department of Defense and Department of Energy to help accelerate our ability to process rare earth, right, minerals and metals. So the question is, did this strategy work, right? So the CHIPS Act, it helped kickstart domestic chip production, which is what we need. I mean, it remains still a shortage. It's going to take some years for that to get going to full extent. The U.S. is making progress in the rare earth processing facility because we focused on it, right? We gave it some attention, right? Tariffs can also work in industries that are facing unfair trade practices. So some tariffs actually do make sense, like when foreign governments manipulate markets by dumping product and by artificially low prices. So they're making themselves a price leader, right? This is what happened with China when they dumped a bunch of steel in, a bunch of cheap steel into the market. So, you put a tariff specifically on that steel at that time, right? Then that makes sense because they're trying to drive out the competition, right? China's trying to pull that billionaire move right here in America by taking a loss leader on their steel products so that they can drive out and close businesses here in the United States. So that might be an area where a tariff makes sense, but it's not a blanket tariff that goes on every item from China, right? It's very specific, right? The broad and blunt approach simply just doesn't work. A one-size-fits-all tariff strategy just invites raising cost and business disruptions and increased prices for consumer. Right? Like we said, most products today aren't just made in one country. And that's just slapping a tariff on any part of that supply chain. So, like so many things that are assembled in America come from products that are made in China. So you slap a big blanket tariff on all these random parts. What happens to the price of goods in the United States? Because now they have to pay more for them. They're going to pass that right along to us. We're the ones that have to pay for that. So a smarter, more targeted approach would be focus on industries that are vital to national security, right? Cases of market manipulation when somebody's dumping a really cheap product into the U.S., slap a high tariff on that to discourage that being sold, right? So we can compete domestically at that point. Right? Maybe on encouraging domestic growth on specific areas we might need, like semiconductors, for example, right? We need those. So let's invest in both sides of that coin. Tariffs on one side, investment on the other side. Maybe we include tax break for those specific people instead of giving a blanket corporate tax break across the board that also hurts the American people. Let's do things that make sense to help America grow, not things that only help the few up top. That's my point there. I don't think I can ever drive that home enough, right? So it should be impaired with domestic manufacturing, workforce training, trade policies that incentivize fair competition. Otherwise, we're just playing, economic whack-a-mole, whoop, 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 right? So the bottom line is a blanket tariff approach does more harm than good. I can't stress that enough. All right, now I'd like to introduce Kate. Kate's going to bring us Kate's Civic Corner every week. She's going to let us know about different civic engagements that are going on in and around the 3rd Congressional District and give you some idea how you might find them in your own area.
Thanks, Ben. Hey, folks, Kate here with the Civic Corner, taking a couple minutes to highlight some opportunities to get involved in Southwest Washington. If you're not in this region, get on the web and do a little digging. I'm sure you'll find a variety of events in your area. We'll put a link in the show notes for each of these events where you can find more information, including what to expect and how to sign up. Coming up on March 13th at 5:30 p.m., the 18th Legislative District Republicans have their caucus meeting. On March 16th at 9 a.m., we have a volunteer opportunity. The Whipple Creek Park Restoration Committee is looking for help with trail maintenance at Whipple Creek Regional Park in Ridgefield. On March 18th at 6 p.m., there's a Clark County Council meeting at the Public Service Center in Vancouver. This can also be attended virtually. And on March 19th at 6 p.m., the 18th Legislative District Democrats have their general meeting, which can be attended via Zoom. If there's an event in Southwest Washington that you'd like us to feature here on Evergreen Perspective, please drop it in the comments or shoot us an email. This is Kate with Kate's Civic Corner, encouraging you to get out there and get involved. Now back to Ben.
So instead of a knee-jerk reaction, just tariff everything strategy, we should be smart with how we're applying these tariffs, focusing on strengthening American industries instead of needlessly punishing businesses and consumers, right? Because at the end of the day, while billionaires play economy, right, and they gain billions or lose very little if it doesn't go the way they thought it was going to be, right? It's not affecting their daily lives. It's affecting our daily lives, right? And I also want to take this chance because I always want to remind people that 1 million is 1,000 millions. 1 billion is 1,000 millions. I think about how much that is for these billionaires, right? They got more money than they could ever feel to lose, right? The people who really feel the pain is everyday hardworking Americans and businesses that rely on those imports. When costs go up, companies either have to eat those expenses, right? Hurting their bottom line and, maybe having to lay off people. People maybe lose their jobs, right? Or they got to increase their prices, right? And either way, maybe now their products don't sell as much because they're too high a price point, right? So they end up having to lay off people anyway, right? I hope I've made that pretty clear. I hope I have expressed that blunt overall blanket tariffs in the modern era, have never been shown to be good for the everyday working American or the economy in the long term, right? All right. That was a lot of information. So let's check in on our buddy Tom and see firsthand, right? His logging company depends on heavy machinery. We know that, right? To keep operating. Saws, loaders, trucks, replacement parts. That stuff doesn't come cheap. So a few months ago, they had an engine go out on one of their loaders, right? It failed. So normally the company would order a replacement part from overseas to have it back up and running in no time. But thanks to tariffs, as blanket tariff, all the prices on all the things went up. So now it's 30% more expensive, right? Ordering domestically wasn't much better for the same reasons we already discussed, right? So U.S. suppliers had raised their prices because they were paying more for raw materials. So the company had two choices: take the financial hit or pass the cost on down the line. At first, they tried to absorb it, right? They wanted to do the right thing. They were going to absorb the cost so that the consumer didn't have to feel it. But after months of rising expenses and materials going up, it just wasn't sustainable, so they had to increase the price of their lumber. That also meant that construction companies buying from them had to raise their prices too. And eventually, those higher costs landed on families looking to build new homes, right? Tom isn't an economist. He's not an economy expert, but, he's pretty clear to see for him, right? He knows what he saw. He saw fewer homes going up, fewer contracts for timber, fewer hours for work for him and his crew, right? So what started off as a trade policy meant to protect American industries had rippled through the entire system, making everything more expensive in ways that weren't easy to predict, right? That's what happens when you put the blanket tariff on it. At the end of the day, tariffs used to work, right? Because the economy was simpler. Today, there's just a much riskier tool that often backfires, doing way more harm than good. Instead of protecting American jobs, they tend to drive up costs, spark trade wars that hurt the very industries they're supposed to help. So I would be remiss at this point because when I was putting this podcast together, I felt it's important to put this piece in here, and it's whatever happened to American manufacturing to begin with. I think the old saying that you reap what you sow fits in here very well, right? For much of the 20th century, the United States was a powerhouse in the world of manufacturing. American factories churned out steel and automobiles and consumer goods, fueling a booming middle class with good wages, right? Good benefits, good union-paying jobs, right? Good job security. But all that started to change, not because America suddenly lost the ability to manufacture, but because corporate greed and the pursuit of the ever higher profits took over, right? They took over the priority. It was more important to get those profits than it was to take care of the American workers. So once again, the ultra-rich put their profits over hard-working, everyday Americans, right? By the 1980s and 90s, major U.S. corporations realized they could dramatically increase their profit margins by shifting their production overseas, right? Well, wages were a fraction of the cost. Companies like General Electric, Nike, Levi's, they weren't struggling. Matter of fact, they were thriving. They were doing better than they'd ever done before. But their executives and shareholders, thriving wasn't enough, right? They figured if I could make a T-shirt for 50 cents in Bangladesh, why would I make it for $5 in North Carolina, right? Why would you do that, right? Then we had the signing of the NAFTA in 1994 and China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. They weren't accidents, people, right? They were deliberate. They were policy choices backed by corporate lobbying. These agreements made it easier for companies to shut down U.S. factories and move their production overseas with minimal penalties, right? So manufacturing jobs were lost because America became less capable, not because they became less capable, but because they were handed over to countries where corporations could exploit cheap labor, right? Weak labor laws, zero environmental regulations, all to boost their bottom line, right? American companies didn't just move jobs overseas. They actively fueled the rise of sweatshop economies around the world. Factories in China and Vietnam and Bangladesh operated under conditions, and some of them still do to this day, that would be illegal in the U.S., right? They're using child labor. They're working 16-hour shifts in unsafe conditions with barely any pay, right? It's unbelievable. Yet U.S. corporations and their CEOs already swimming in billions of dollars push for these shifts to maximize their profits even further, right? So not only did jobs move overseas, but they also figured on how to avoid paying their fair share of taxes as well, setting up shell corporations and offshore banking accounts. Massive companies like Apple, Amazon, and Walmart have raked in billions paying little to no corporate taxes. Meanwhile, the American working class foots the bill for roads and schools and infrastructure, right? Things that these corporations also benefit from, right? They were doing stock buybacks over workers' wages instead of reinvesting in the American worker. Many corporations use their newfound savings from cheap labor to pump up their stocks, right? Here we are. The economy's doing great. The economy's booming. Economy's only booming if you got billions already, right? Most of us are living paycheck to paycheck, just trying to get by. Meanwhile, CEOs and executives are cashing in on massive bonuses and then the stock buybacks, right? While the workers who spent decades building these companies were left unemployed, right? Communities decimated, hollowed out, right? The results of this, entire towns across the U.S. turned into ghost towns seemingly overnight, right? Wages as a whole in the United States stagnated, flat, right? The middle class started to shrink, right? The American consumers were given the illusion of cheaper goods, but the long-term cost has been devastating. Fewer good-paying jobs, the continued huge growth of income inequality, and an economy increasingly controlled by a handful of billionaires. Meanwhile, those same corporations that offshore jobs now demand bailouts when their risky financial decisions go south, right? So, and who pays for that? We do. Right? Our tax dollars pay for those bailouts, right? The workers from all this, or the wages of fallout, they just, now what do? They don't have jobs. They aren't reskilled to do new jobs, right? Now those workers have to be on benefits, further costing taxpayers more money, therefore giving the wealthy more government welfare. That's what it is. It's billionaire welfare, right? This wasn't about global competition or market forces. It was a conscious choice by the wealthiest and most powerful to maximize their profits and cut costs, even if it meant gutting American manufactured and exploiting foreign workers in poor working conditions, kids working, etc. Now, when policymakers discuss tariffs and reshoring jobs, they're trying to patch a hole that they opened wide open with their policy decisions. Because the same people that made these policy decisions are still holding public office because we keep reelecting them. You want term limits? Vote for somebody else who's going to do something different. That brings us back. Let's go back full circle. Sorry, I got a little fired up there. Let's bring it back a little bit. Let's talk about Tom, right? Let's go back to Tom. Tom, the lumberjack, right? Timber has long been a cornerstone of Washington's 3rd District. It's more than just an industry. It's a way of life, supporting generations of workers and their families. In an ideal world, Tom's logs are cut, processed, and sold to market at fair prices. But here's where things get complicated. Tariffs on export, particularly retaliatory ones from countries like China and Canada, have made it more expensive for buyers overseas to purchase American lumber. That means a backlog of unsold wood, shrinking profits for local mills, and in some cases, layoffs. Mills that once boomed, ran at full capacity, are now forced to shut down, cut shifts, right? Workers like Tom, who've spent decades in the industry, the future suddenly feels uncertain. But it doesn't stop in the force. The construction industry feels the squeeze. Let's fast forward to a construction site here in Vancouver and meet Lisa, the owner of a small-run construction company. She's been in business for over a decade, building homes for middle-class families and priding herself on quality craftsmanship at affordable prices. But suddenly, the cost of materials has skyrocketed. Lumber is 20% more expensive than it was last year, and her suppliers tell her that there's no relief in sight. What's the problem? Oh, tariffs. While U.S. timber companies struggle to sell their lumber abroad, domestic prices are rising due to supply constraints and higher operational costs, right? The price hikes aren't just limited to wood, nails, steel beams, and machinery parts. It's all affected, right? Every bit of it. It's all gone up, right? So Lisa now faces the impossible decision. Charge higher prices or risk losing customers, or try to absorb the cost herself and watch her margins shrink to nothing. Right? She's already had to lay off a couple of her workers. Both of those were single parents. But because she can't afford to keep the payroll going at the same levels, the project she once confidently bid on, she hesitates to even take. And that brings us to Sam and Emily. The dream of homeownership slipping away from them. They're a young, recently married couple. They're ready to take the next step and buy their first home. Right? They've been saving for years, cutting expenses, never going out, working extra hours when they were available. They met with Lisa to discuss their project. And a home that once cost $400,000 is now $500,000. Suddenly, they can't afford the mortgage payment anymore. Right? The down payment they'd worked so hard for so many years to save isn't nearly enough to keep up with the rising prices. Lisa can see the disappointment in their face, and she wishes she could do something about it. But she's already stretched as thin as she can be at the breaking point. There's no more discounts or deals that she can give. And we can all trace this back to the ripple effect that tariffs have had, from forest to the mill to the construction site to the home buyers. These aren't just abstract policy decisions. They affect real people. People like Tom, who worries if his job is still going to be there next year. People like Lisa, who built her business from the ground up, but is now wondering, can she keep it running? And then young couple, Sam and Emily, who've put their dream of home ownership on hold indefinitely. This is particularly alarming as Wall Street, backed by the ultra-rich, continues to buy up American single-family homes, right? Squeezing everyday home buyers out of the market by coming in with cash only on the spot. What was once the cornerstone of the American dream, owning a home, is slipping away further and further out of reach for everyday hardworking Americans. Instead of us hardworking families being able to buy these homes, they're being forced to rent, right? Enriching the corporate landlords while stripping away opportunities of generational wealth for these young families. The result is a nation where fewer people own homes. More families are at the mercy of rising rents, right? Their dream of homeownership becomes just that, just a dream. So what are we becoming as a nation? A nation of renters, right? Does the feudal system ring a bell, right? Corporate landlords and institutional investors backed by ultra wealthy and the billionaires are amassing massive amounts of residential real estate, right? The average working family priced out of homeownership is forced into renting long term, right? Some form of modern like rent tax. Pay it to the corporate overlords, right? Instead of working the land in the feudal system, modern renters work as many jobs as they can to continue to afford skyrocketing rents and housing costs, right? While the wealth continues to accumulate and rise up, right? In feudal times, people were often legally bound to the land they worked. Today, right, it's economic forces with sky-high prices and predatory investment practices and policy failures that keep people stuck renting with little hope of ever owning. So, are we heading back to feudalism? Maybe not in name, but in function. The parallels are hard to ignore, right? Instead of lords of vassals, we have the lords of Wall Street, perhaps, right? Making us lifelong tenants. Unless something changes, the ability to own land, which used to be a key indicator of middle-class America, to be able to work hard and buy a little piece of property and maybe build a house or have a house built or whatever the case may be, it's now starting to be reserved for privilege of the elite and the upper class, right? So, I don't know. Where do we go from here? We've covered a lot today, to say the least. From the history of tariffs to the impact on everyday Americans, the trade war growing, crisis of home ownership. You know, one thing's clear is we're living through a time of massive economic transformation. And I have to say, not for the better, right? The truth is, tariffs won't fix the challenges we face. If used wisely in a targeted way, it might help some specific industries, but they have to be more specific, right? And we know that. Otherwise, they're going to backfire, raising costs for businesses, hurting us, leading to unemployment, right? And this is where policymakers need to step up. And this is where we as voters need to step up and listen to what our politicians are saying. We need to look at their voting records, see how they voted, right? A much smarter approach would be a balanced economic policy that would include targeted tariffs. Tariffs. Ugh, it's a tough word. Tariffs. So, we can target specific areas that are going to help us build a stronger economy, provide more jobs. But we just can't do blanket tariffs across the board. Those aren't going to help us, right? We can do housing reform, right? We can push back against Wall Street's takeover of the housing market, give the middle-class families a chance, a real shot at homeownership, right? We can work on starting to bring back that manufacturing, right? But it's useless if the workers don't have the skills, so we need more job training for American citizens. We need more training to be able to do these new jobs, these new high-tech jobs, right? We got to invest in the American citizen to be able to get more educated, right? So if you're out there trying to buy your first home, but it feels like the market is stacked against you, I feel it. If you're a small business owner like Lisa fighting for rising costs to stay afloat, I hear you. I hear you. If you're a worker like Tom watching whatever industry you're working in shrink, wondering what's going to be next, you're not alone. You're not alone. And the challenges we're facing, they weren't created overnight, and they won't be fixed overnight either. But what we can do is we can demand better policy. We can demand better leadership. We can vote for better leadership, one that's not afraid to stand up for the working American people instead of just cowering down to their campaign donors. Americans, not just the billionaires, need to be able to do well in this country. Because at the end of the day, this country was built by hardworking, everyday American people. And if we let them continue to have this power over us, then we're going to become a nation of renters, a workforce with no ownership and no stake in a future. And you know what? That's not the America I believe in. So I just ask that you keep the conversation going and don't be afraid to have this conversation, right? I'm always here to listen, right? You can always comment below this YouTube or jump online and join the discussion on any one of our other social media channels. I'd love to hear from you. Tell me how tariffs or trade policies have affected your life, how rising cost and home ownership is squeezing out. If you have any ideas on what type of policy or what we could do locally here in the 3rd Congressional District, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. So if you're listening, you can always watch this on YouTube. If you're watching it on YouTube and you want to listen to it on the go, you can find it anywhere you get your podcast. So this episode gave you something to think about. Consider leaving a 5-star review, 5 stars only. Sharing Evergreen Perspective with your friends. The more we talk about these things, the more help that it's going to give, right? I always ask that conversations remain civil. Name calling doesn't have a place here. That doesn't help anything at all. So I just ask that each of you take care of yourself and take care of each other. And until next time, I'm Ben Chrisley. This is Evergreen Perspective, and I'll see you soon.